For my 32nd birthday, my grandfather handed me a folded piece of paper and whispered to run. It was a check for $900,000. Before I could reach the hallway, my brother locked the study door, his face twisted with a greed I had never seen before. He demanded the money. When I refused, he slapped me across the face so hard my knees gave out. His wife, a high-profile corporate attorney, stood blocking the only exit. She pulled out her phone and smiled, telling me to hand it over, or she would call the police and claim I assaulted a frail old man for his fortune. They thought they had backed a helpless victim into a corner. They had no idea they had just triggered a federal trap I had spent 2 years building. My name is Nora, and I am 32 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The metallic click of the deadbolt echoing in Trent's mahogany-paneled study sounded like a gunshot. I stood completely still, clutching the crisp piece of paper my grandfather Henry had just slipped into my palm. The ink on the $900,000 check was barely dry. Outside the heavy oak doors, the muffled sounds of my birthday party continued. Laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft jazz music my parents had hired for the evening drifted through the walls of my brother's extravagant Connecticut mansion. But inside the study, the air was suffocatingly thick. Trent stepped away from the locked door and marched toward me. He was 35 years old, wearing a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my first car, but his face was entirely stripped of the charming chief financial officer persona he presented to the world. Right now, he just looked desperate. He held out his hand, palm up his fingers, twitching with impatience. "Give it to me, Nora," he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "Give me the check right now." I gripped the paper tighter, my knuckles turning white. "Why would I give you a birthday gift that Grandpa Henry explicitly wrote out to my name? Because the family business needs cash flow, and you do not need almost $1 million to fund whatever pathetic dead-end life you are living in that cramped apartment." Trent took another step closer, looming over me. "Do not play games with me. You are a worthless college dropout. You have no idea how to manage that kind of wealth. I am the CFO of this family. That money belongs in my corporate accounts to protect our assets. Hand it over." I looked him dead in the eye, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "The money stays with me, Trent. Grandpa made his choice." The slap came so fast I did not even have time to blink. Trent swung his arm with his full body weight behind it. The sharp crack of his palm connecting with my cheekbone sent a violent shockwave through my skull. My vision flashed white. I stumbled backward, my high heels catching on the thick Persian rug, and I crashed hard onto the hardwood floor. The metallic taste of blood instantly flooded my mouth. My ear was ringing in a high-pitched tone that drowned out the jazz music playing in the distance. As I lay there against the floorboards, feeling the throbbing heat bloom across the side of my face, I was violently pulled back to a memory from 16 years ago. I was 16 years old, standing at the top of the grand staircase in our childhood home. Trent had been furious that I had accidentally spilled juice on his graduation gown. He had shoved me square in the chest. I tumbled down an entire flight of stairs, bruising my ribs and twisting my ankle. When my mother Beatrice found me crying at the bottom of the stairs, she did not scold Trent. She simply looked down at me with cold irritation and told me to stop being clumsy and ruining your brother's graduation day. They had always protected him. They had always punished me. I slowly pushed myself up onto my elbows, wiping a drop of blood from the corner of my mouth. I did not cry. I had stopped crying over this family a long time ago. Before I could get to my feet, Nia stepped out from the shadows near the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Trent's wife was a formidable presence. A striking African-American corporate defense attorney, she was dressed in a sleek crimson dress, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. She looked down at me with absolute disgust, her stilettos planted firmly in front of the only exit. "You really should listen to your brother, Nora," Nia said smoothly, her tone dripping with the kind of condescension she usually reserved for hostile witnesses in a courtroom. She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out her smartphone, tapping the screen to unlock it. Be smart for once in your life. Drop the check on the desk and walk away. I pushed myself up to a standing position, smoothing down the front of my dress. And if I do not? Nia smiled, a predatory gleam in her eyes. Then I dial 911 right now. I will tell the dispatcher that we walked into the study to find you physically assaulting your poor, confused grandfather. I will say you forced him to sign that check and attacked Trent when he tried to intervene to save the old man. She tilted her head, tapping her manicured nail against the phone screen. Who do you think the police will believe, Nora? A highly respected corporate lawyer and a prominent CFO, or a miserable college dropout with zero prospects? You will be in a holding cell before they even serve the birthday cake. Trent laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You have no power here, Nora. You are nothing. Give me the check. They were so confident. They were so utterly convinced that I was still the weak, easily intimidated girl they had bullied for decades. They had no idea that I was not a struggling dropout. They did not know that I owned a federal cybersecurity contracting firm, and they certainly did not know that this confrontation was exactly what I had been waiting for. I looked at the locked mahogany door. Then I looked at the heavy brass bookend resting on the edge of Trent's antique desk. I did not argue. I did not plead for them to understand. I simply lunged. I grabbed the solid brass bookend, its weight grounding me in the reality of the moment. Trent yelled out, stepping forward to grab my arm, but I spun away from him. I did not aim for the solid wood of the main door. Instead, I turned toward the massive decorative glass paneled doors that led directly out to the side garden. Are you crazy? Nia shrieked, taking a step back as I raised my arm. I swung the brass bookend with every ounce of strength I possessed. The heavy metal smashed into the center of the glass door. A deafening crash shattered the quiet tension of the room as safety glass exploded outward, raining down onto the stone patio in a cascade of glittering shards. The cool night air rushed into the stuffy study. Catch her, Trent roared, diving across the desk to tackle me. But I was already moving. I leaped through the shattered frame, ignoring the sharp edges of glass that tore at the hem of my dress. My heels hit the stone patio, and I did not look back. I sprinted across the manicured lawn, the $900,000 check gripped tightly in my fist. Behind me, I could hear Trent and Nia screaming my name into the darkness, their voices filled with rage and panic. I reached my car, threw myself into the driver's seat, and slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the pavement as I tore out of the driveway, leaving my toxic family and my fake birthday celebration far behind. The cold night wind whipped through my open window as I pushed the accelerator toward the floorboard. My tires grabbed the asphalt, rocketing my car down the winding suburban road, away from Trent's sprawling estate. The sound of shattering glass still echoed in my ears, mixed with the enraged screams of my brother and his wife. My chest heaved with the leftover adrenaline of the ambush. I glanced down at the passenger seat where the $900,000 check lay bathed in the faint green glow of my dashboard. My phone mounted on the console immediately began to vibrate. The screen illuminated the dark cabin with a rapid-fire succession of text messages. They were not from Trent. They were from my parents. I tapped the screen to read the notifications aloud as I navigated the sharp curves of the highway. Beatrice, the woman who had spent 32 years treating me like an unpaid servant, sent the first barrage. Turn that car around this instant. You are stealing from this family. Trent needs that money to stabilize the company. Stop being so incredibly selfish and bring it back. A second later, a message from Richard popped up. You have always been a massive embarrassment to our name. Trent works 80 hours a week to keep a roof over our heads. You drop out of school, do nothing with your life, and now you decide to rob your own grandfather. Turn around right now, or I will personally make sure you spend the rest of your life locked in a concrete cell. You are entirely disowned. Their words did not break my heart. They only hardened it. I stared at the road ahead, gripping the leather steering wheel until my fingers ached. This was the exact same script they had used when I was 20 years old. I remembered standing in our old kitchen holding my modest bank book. I had saved $8,000 working night shifts to afford my return to community college. Richard had backed me against the refrigerator, shouting that Trent needed a massive legal settlement paid off because he had wrecked a company car while intoxicated. My parents forced me to drain my entire education fund to save my golden child brother from jail. They told me family requires sacrifice. But the sacrifice was always demanded from me, never from him. I swerved off the main highway and pulled into the glowing canopy of a deserted gas station. I threw the car into park and snatched the check off the passenger seat. I turned on the overhead dome light to examine it properly. Grandpa Henry had slipped this to me in secret. He had told me to run. That did not make sense for a simple birthday gift. I held the crisp paper up to the light. My family thought I was a failure who struggled to pay rent. They had absolutely no idea that I spent my days analyzing the complex financial structures of the largest corporations in the world. As the founder of a highly classified federal cybersecurity firm, I hunted digital anomalies for a living. And the piece of paper in my hand was a massive anomaly. My eyes scanned past the staggering $900,000 amount and locked onto the routing and account numbers printed along the bottom edge. The sequence was wrong. A domestic trust account follows a very specific 9-digit structure. The sequence printed on this check was 11 digits featuring a distinctive alphanumeric prefix. I recognized that prefix immediately. I had seen it dozens of times during federal audits. This check was not drawn from Grandpa Henry's personal retirement trust. It was drawn from a Cayman Islands offshore shell corporation. My grandfather was an old-school conservative businessman. He kept his money in local brick-and-mortar banks. He absolutely despised offshore accounts, calling them the playground of cowards and criminals. There was zero chance he had willingly moved nearly $1 million to the Caribbean. This check was not a generous birthday present. It was a digital breadcrumb. It was a distress signal wrapped in a financial transaction. Suddenly, my phone screen flashed with an incoming audio file. It was from Nia. I tapped the play icon and my sister-in-law's voice filled the quiet car. Her tone was devoid of any emotion, cold and legally precise. Nora listened to me very carefully. I am currently drafting an emergency injunction. I have a superior court judge on speed dial who owes my corporate defense firm a very large favor. If you do not pull back into this driveway in exactly 30 minutes, I will have every single bank account associated with your social security number completely frozen. You will not be able to buy a gallon of gas. You will not be able to pay your cheap rent. I will make sure you are sleeping on the street by tomorrow morning. Do not test me. You are out of your depth. Nia was brilliant in the courtroom, but she was arrogant. Her entire threat relied on the assumption that I only possessed the meager, publicly visible checking account I used to pay my utility bills. She assumed I was financially defenseless. She did not know that my actual wealth was protected behind military-grade encryption protocols that her corrupt judge could never penetrate. I deleted the voice note with a single swipe of my finger. I did not text back. I did not panic. I shifted the car back into drive, pulled out of the gas station, and accelerated hard down the highway, heading straight toward the downtown financial district. The streets were mostly empty at this hour, allowing me to make excellent time. I pulled up to the towering, imposing glass structure of the city's largest central bank. I threw my car into a reserved parking spot right near the entrance. I stepped out into the crisp night air, my heels clicking sharply against the pavement. I walked through the sliding glass doors, entirely ignoring the security guard who stepped forward to ask for my appointment details. I marched straight past the row of empty teller stations and headed directly for the branch manager's private suite. I pushed open the heavy glass door without knocking. The branch manager looked up from his computer monitor, his eyes wide with shock at my sudden intrusion. I did not say a single word. I walked straight up to his polished mahogany desk and dropped the $900,000 check squarely in front of him. Mr. Gallagher was a man who usually commanded a room with quiet authority. He had managed the central branch for 15 years and handled the accounts of the city's wealthiest families. He picked up the piece of paper with a perfectly manicured hand, ready to deliver a polite reprimand for my unannounced entry. Instead, his eyes locked onto the 11-digit routing number. The healthy pink flush instantly vanished from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a ghost in a tailored suit. He dropped the check as if it had physically burned him. He did not say a word to me. He simply stood up, rushed past me, and flipped the heavy brass deadbolt on his office door. A loud, definitive click sealed us inside. Then he moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows facing the main lobby and yanked the blinds shut. "Ma'am," he said, his voice trembling so badly he could barely get the words out. "Please call the police. Call them right now." I stood my ground, keeping my posture rigid. "Mr. Gallagher, I am not here to rob you. This check was given to me tonight by my grandfather Henry. I just need you to run a verification on the routing origin." He backed away from his desk, shaking his head frantically. "You do not understand. I do not need to run that routing number. I have it memorized. Every senior compliance officer in this state has it memorized. That is not a standard trust account. That specific sequence has been flagged by the IRS, the SEC, and federal authorities for the last 6 months." My mind raced, processing the information at lightning speed. Flagged for what exactly? Massive, systematic money laundering, Gallagher whispered, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "It is a Cayman Islands shell company directly linked to Trent Corporate Holdings. We received a confidential federal bulletin warning us that any transaction attempted with this account number must be immediately reported to the authorities. Whoever holds that paper is holding the key to a multi-million-dollar federal crime." The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. The throbbing pain in my cheek from Trent's slap was entirely eclipsed by the massive, terrifying realization washing over me. Grandpa Henry was not senile. He was not confused. When he pressed that check into my hand and told me to run, he was not just giving me an early birthday present. He was handing me the loaded gun. For 5 years, Trent and Nia had been bleeding the family business dry, funneling the profits into offshore accounts and using their corporate lawyers to cover their tracks. Grandpa Henry must have discovered the rot eating away at his life's work. But he was old, frail, and trapped in a house surrounded by Trent's hired caregivers and Nia's legal traps. He could not go to the police himself without Nia intercepting it and declaring him mentally unfit. So he used me. He wrote a massive, undeniable check from the dirty offshore account and gave it to the one person he knew the family despised enough to chase. The one person who would not back down. Me. He knew Trent would panic. He knew Trent would try to take it back by force, because the moment this check hit a legitimate banking system, the federal alarms would trip and the entire money laundering empire would collapse. He gave me the proof, I said aloud, my voice steadying as the puzzle pieces snapped into place. Trent did not just slap me for the money, he slapped me because this piece of paper is a one-way ticket to federal prison. Gallagher nodded, his eyes darting toward the closed blinds. "Yes. And if your brother knows you have it, he will not stop until he gets it back. You need to call the authorities right now before he finds you." Before I could even reach for my phone, a sound pierced the quiet of the office. The shrill, piercing wail of police sirens echoed down the downtown avenue, growing louder by the second. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect off the high glass windows of the bank lobby, painting the walls in erratic, frantic colors. Nia had not been bluffing. She had used her connections, her prestige, and her venom to mobilize the local police. But they were not here to protect anyone. They were here to execute her threat. They were here to silence the ugly dropout before she could expose the golden child. Gallagher backed against the far wall, his breath catching in his throat. I stepped cautiously toward the drawn blinds, parting 2 of the slats just enough to see out into the expansive marble-floored lobby. 2 squad cars had jumped the curb, parking diagonally across the main entrance. The heavy glass doors of the bank slid open, and 4 people stormed inside. 2 local police officers marched in with their hands resting intimidatingly on their duty belts. Right behind them was Trent, adjusting the cuffs of his suit to appear composed and victimized. And leading the charge was Nia. She looked furious, her eyes scanning the empty teller stations with predatory precision. Nia did not hesitate. She marched straight past the security desk and pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at Gallagher's locked office door. "She is in there," Nia shouted, her voice carrying through the quiet bank. Arrest the thief right now. The officers unclipped their radios and started marching straight toward the mahogany door standing between me and absolute ruin. The heavy wooden door shuddered violently, before swinging inward, banging loudly against the interior wall of the office. Two uniformed officers stepped into the room, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts, their eyes scanning for a threat. Trent pushed his way past them, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon to save a life. Nia followed close behind her face, contorted into a mask of absolute terror and distress that would have won her a daytime television award. She was a master manipulator, and right now she was putting on the performance of a lifetime. "There she is!" Nia cried out, pointing a trembling finger directly at my chest. "She is the one, officers. She assaulted her own grandfather tonight. She forced him to sign away his savings and stole a check for nearly $1 million. He is a frail old man with severe dementia. She is trying to drain his estate before he passes away." Trent stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on his wife's shoulder while glaring at me with poorly concealed malice. "My grandfather is terrified," Trent lied smoothly to the officers, his voice dripping with fake concern. "My sister has a history of severe mental instability. She dropped out of college, she cannot hold down a job, and tonight she completely snapped. She attacked me when I tried to stop her from robbing him. Look at her hand. She is still holding the stolen check." The taller of the two officers stepped toward me, his expression hardening into a stern mask of authority. "Ma'am, I am going to need you to put the piece of paper down on the desk and step away. Keep your hands where I can see them." I did not panic. When you spend your life being gaslit by narcissists, you learn early on that panic is a luxury you cannot afford. You learn to rely on irrefutable data. I slowly lowered my hand, placing the red-flagged offshore check onto Gallagher's polished desk. Then I reached into the pocket of my blazer with deliberate slowness. "She has a weapon!" Naya shrieked, deliberately trying to escalate the situation so the officers would tackle me to the ground. "I have a smartphone," I said, my voice cutting through the hysterical performance like a scalpel. I held up the device, the screen already illuminated. "Officers, my sister-in-law is a highly skilled corporate defense attorney. She makes a living twisting narratives. But as a cybersecurity auditor, I prefer raw data. My job requires me to anticipate hostile threats, and tonight I knew I was walking into a room with two people who have spent their entire lives treating me like a disposable punching bag. So before my brother locked the door to his study, I pressed record." Trent's face drained of color. Nia's fake tears instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer calculating panic. I tapped the play icon on my screen and cranked the volume to maximum. The crystal-clear audio filled the tense silence of the bank manager's office. First came Trent's voice, harsh and demanding, yelling that the family business needed cash flow and calling me a worthless dropout. Then came the unmistakable, sickening smack of a hand striking flesh, followed by the heavy thud of my body hitting the floorboards. The officers exchanged a sharp, immediate glance. The recording continued broadcasting Nia's chillingly calm blackmail threat to the entire room. "Hand it over, Nora. Or I call 911 and tell them you assaulted Grandpa for his check." Who will the police believe, a high-profile lawyer or a miserable dropout? I paused the playback and looked directly at the taller officer. "They told you I assaulted my grandfather. They told you I stole this check. You just heard them manufacturing that exact lie 20 minutes ago to cover up an unprovoked physical assault against me." The officers visibly relaxed their aggressive stances. The shorter officer sighed, rubbing the back of his neck in profound annoyance. He recognized exactly what this was. This was not a grand larceny in progress. This was a messy, vindictive civil dispute between wealthy family members trying to use the police department as their personal enforcement squad. "Sir," the taller officer said, turning to Trent with a stern, unimpressed glare. "Filing a false police report is a criminal offense. We are not here to mediate your family inheritance drama. If you struck your sister, she is the one who has grounds to press charges tonight." Trent opened his mouth to argue, his fists clenching at his sides, but Nia quickly grabbed his arm, her manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. She was a lawyer. She knew when a trap had failed, and she knew when to pivot. The authorities were no longer her weapon. There has clearly been a massive misunderstanding, Nia said, her voice dropping back to its usual icy professional register. She shot a venomous glare at Gallagher, then focused entirely on me. This is a private family matter regarding a disputed financial asset. We will handle this in civil court. She leaned in close to me, dropping her voice so the officers could not hear. You think a little audio file saves you. You have no idea what is coming for you. Enjoy your empty bank accounts, Nora. We will ruin you so thoroughly, you will wish you had never left that study. Nia yanked Trent by the elbow, forcibly pulling him out of the office. The two officers followed them into the main lobby, requesting that they step outside to formally take their statements and issue a warning about wasting police resources. The heavy glass door swung shut, leaving me alone with bank manager Gallagher. The silence in the room was deafening. My heart was hammering against my ribs, the adrenaline crash threatening to make my hands shake. I reached down to grab my purse from the floor, preparing to leave before Trent could devise a secondary plan. As I lifted my bag, Gallagher stepped forward. He did not speak. His eyes darted nervously toward the closed blinds, checking for any lingering observers in the lobby. He reached into his tailored vest pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. With a swift, practiced motion, he slipped it directly into the open compartment of my purse. I looked down. It was a solid titanium USB drive, the exact kind used for storing heavily encrypted classified data. I looked up at Gallagher, my brow furrowing in confusion. Gallagher kept his voice to a barely audible whisper. Your grandfather visited me last week. He told me to keep this locked in the main vault. He said that if you came in here with that red flag check, and if you actually survived the slap your brother was guaranteed to give you, then you would know exactly what to do with this. I felt the cold, heavy weight of the titanium USB drive settle at the bottom of my purse. Gallagher gave me a single frantic nod before backing away and gesturing toward a private emergency exit at the rear of his suite. I did not waste time asking questions. I slipped out the back door, navigating the narrow security corridor that led to the alleyway behind the bank. By the time I heard Trent shouting my name in the main lobby, I was already behind the wheel of my car, pulling out into the dark city streets. I steered toward the edge of the financial district, my hands gripping the wheel as the adrenaline began to level out into a cold, sharp focus. My fuel gauge was hovering near empty, so I pulled into a brightly lit gas station a few blocks from my apartment. I swiped my personal debit card at the pump. The screen flashed a bright red error message. Declined. I frowned and pulled out my backup credit card, inserting the chip. Declined. A notification popped up on my phone screen a second later from my banking app. It stated that all my public financial assets had been frozen by a court-ordered temporary restraining order. Nia had not been bluffing. She had used her late-night judicial connections to instantly freeze the only bank accounts they knew about, painting me as an immediate flight risk who had stolen nearly $1 million from an elderly family member. They wanted me stranded, broke, and terrified. I paid for a few gallons of gas using the emergency cash I kept in my glove compartment, and drove the rest of the way to my modest, unassuming apartment building on the outskirts of the city. As I unlocked my front door, my phone buzzed with an incoming text from a cousin I had not spoken to in nearly a decade. The message contained no words, just a link to a social media video. I clicked the link and my mother's face filled the screen. Beatrice was sitting in her lavish living room, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. She was putting on a masterclass in manipulation. In a trembling, heartbroken voice, she told the camera that her severely mentally unstable daughter had suffered a complete psychotic break. Beatrice wept as she spun a vicious lie, claiming I had violently attacked my grandfather and my brother, begging our extended family and friends for prayers as they dealt with my tragic, erratic behavior. Watching her fake tears, a wave of familiar disgust washed over me. This was her signature move. She had executed this exact same psychological warfare 10 years ago when I first tried to warn our extended family that Trent was siphoning money from my college fund to pay off his gambling debts. Instead of holding her golden child accountable, Beatrice had launched a preemptive strike. She called every aunt, uncle, and cousin we had crying on the phone, telling them I was delusional and suffering from paranoid hallucinations. She completely isolated me, ensuring that no one would ever believe a single word I said. That was the real reason I left college. I had not dropped out because I failed. I dropped out because my own mother starved me of my tuition money and poisoned my entire support system. I locked the front door of my apartment and tossed my phone onto the cheap thrift store sofa in the living room. Let them think I was crying in the dark. Let them believe they had successfully backed the poor, miserable dropout into a corner. I walked down the narrow hallway and placed my hand flat against the unassuming wooden door of my home office. A concealed biometric scanner verified my fingerprints, followed by a soft mechanical click as the heavy reinforced steel core of the door unlocked. I stepped inside and the lights automatically hummed to life, revealing a room that stood in stark contrast to the shabby exterior of my apartment. 4 massive curved monitors spanned the length of a custom server desk. Rack-mounted processors blinked with rhythmic green lights in the corner. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and placed the titanium USB drive Gallagher had given me gently on the desk. I was not a broke dropout. I was the founder and lead architect of Apex Cyber Defense, a highly classified cybersecurity firm that handled threat mitigation for federal agencies. My real wealth, my actual life, existed entirely off the grid, hidden behind layers of encrypted corporate shells and military-grade firewalls that Nia and Trent could never even fathom, let alone subpoena. I woke up my workstation and logged directly into my secure server. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. Nia thought she had trapped me by freezing my public accounts, but by actively engaging the banking network to target my social security number, she had left a digital footprint wide open. I initiated a targeted trace on her legal firm's network and cross-referenced it with Trent's corporate network at the family business. Lines of code rapidly scrolled across my left monitor as my proprietary algorithms sliced through Trent's pathetically outdated corporate firewalls. They had spent millions on luxury cars and country club memberships, but they had clearly neglected their IT department. Within minutes, I had full undetected back-end access to Trent's executive email server. I ran a real-time intercept on all outgoing traffic from the chief financial officer account. A highly encrypted message immediately caught my attention. It was flagged with maximum priority and had just been sent to an untraceable offshore broker based in the Cayman Islands. I bypassed the encryption key with a brute force script I had designed for the Department of Defense. The contents of the email decoded and spilled across my center screen. I leaned forward, my blood running completely cold as I read the subject line. The email was brief, ruthless, and terrifying. It read, "Initiate full liquidation immediately. Henry is dying." My breath caught in my throat. Trent was not just trying to steal the money to cover his losses. The situation was infinitely worse. My grandfather was running out of time, and my brother was preparing to burn the entire estate to the ground before the night was over. I stared at the glowing text on my center monitor, the sheer audacity of my brother's command paralyzing me for a fraction of a second. Then muscle memory took over. I isolated the connection, cloaked my IP address through a rotating proxy matrix in Eastern Europe, and launched a deep dive into the architecture of Trent's corporate network. If Trent had spent a fraction of his golf club membership fees on competent IT security, I might have needed an hour to bypass his firewalls. Instead, his system was protected by obsolete factory default protocols. It was like putting a cheap padlock on a paper door. I shredded their perimeter defenses in less than 4 minutes. Once inside the main server, I bypassed the standard employee directories and targeted the restricted executive drives. I deployed a scraping script to hunt for hidden financial ledgers, specifically looking for offshore routing numbers, matching the one printed on Grandpa Henry's check. The search results populated on my right screen, cascading in a relentless waterfall of PDF documents, wire transfer logs, and encrypted legal contracts drawn up by Nia's firm. I began opening the files, my eyes scanning the staggering numbers. The truth was laid bare in black and white data. Trent's manufacturing company was not booming. It was a rotting carcass. For the past 5 years, the business had been hemorrhaging cash, plagued by gross mismanagement, toxic investments, and Trent's own insatiable appetite for an extravagant lifestyle he could not actually afford. To keep up the illusion of the wealthy, successful golden child, Trent and Nia had turned to the only available source of capital: Grandpa Henry's estate. I tracked the digital paper trail backward. Starting 5 years ago, small, seemingly innocuous amounts had been transferred out of Henry's legitimate accounts into a network of dummy corporations. Nia had used her legal expertise to construct a labyrinth of shell companies, moving the money through multiple jurisdictions before finally depositing it into the Cayman Islands account. As Trent's business losses mounted, the stolen amounts grew exponentially. They had drained millions. They were bleeding our grandfather dry, while simultaneously convincing our parents that Trent was a financial genius. I opened the most recent transaction log, cross-referencing it with the urgent email I had just intercepted. Trent's CFO was attempting to execute a final massive wire transfer. They were preparing to move the entirety of Henry's remaining domestic wealth, his property deeds, his liquid cash, his retirement portfolios into the offshore account by midnight. Once that money crossed international borders into the Caymans, it would vanish into the legal void, completely untouchable by U.S. authorities. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the timeline of the pending transfer. It was scheduled to execute automatically at midnight. Suddenly, the brilliance of Grandpa Henry's actions hit me with the force of a freight train. He was not a helpless victim waiting for the end. He was a master tactician who had realized he was surrounded by traitors. Henry must have discovered the embezzlement. He knew Trent and Nia were preparing for the final sweep. He also knew that as a frail old man under their constant supervision, he could not simply walk into a police station. Nia would have intercepted him, declared him legally incompetent, and seized power of attorney immediately. He needed an external force to intervene, something so massive and unstoppable that even Nia's corrupt legal connections could not suppress it. He needed a federal freeze. That was the purpose of the $900,000 check. Henry knew that specific Cayman routing number was dirty. He knew the feds were watching it. He intentionally wrote a bad check from the flagged account and pressed it into my hands, knowing my stubbornness would force me to verify it. He used me as the ultimate tripwire. By handing me that check, he guaranteed that a legitimate bank would scan the routing number, instantly alerting the federal authorities and freezing every single asset tied to the Cayman account before Trent's midnight transfer could process. Grandpa Henry had sacrificed a piece of the board to lock down the entire game. He had effectively blown up Trent's escape route. I began frantically highlighting the ledgers, the wire logs, and Nia's fraudulent contracts, compiling everything into a massive encrypted zip file. I needed to package this evidence for the FBI White-Collar Crime Division immediately. The local police were useless, but federal agents would tear Trent's life apart. Just as the progress bar on my download hit 80%, a sharp buzzing tone shattered the silence of my home office. It was not my primary smartphone. It was a prepaid burner phone I kept locked in my desk drawer, a dedicated secure line I used strictly for emergencies. I snatched the phone from the drawer and answered it, not bothering with a greeting. "Nora," a voice whispered urgently through the receiver. It was Sarah, a night shift charge nurse at City General Hospital. I had helped Sarah out of a severe cybersecurity stalking situation 2 years ago, and she owed me a massive favor. I had asked her to keep a discreet watch on Grandpa Henry's medical records. "Sarah, what is going on?" I asked, my fingers still flying across the keyboard to finalize the data export. "You need to get down here right now," Sarah said, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "I am hiding in the supply closet on the 4th floor. Your grandfather was rushed in through the emergency room an hour ago. He suffered a massive catastrophic stroke. He is in the intensive care unit right now, and his condition is critical." My stomach dropped. A stroke. The sheer stress of the confrontation of slipping me the check and knowing the fallout must have triggered it. "He is in the ICU," I repeated, grabbing my keys and shoving the encrypted titanium drive back into my purse. "Is he conscious?" "Barely," Sarah replied, her breath hitching. "But Nora, that is not why I am calling. You need to hurry. Your brother and his wife just bypassed the front desk. They marched straight into the ICU." I froze, my hand resting on the steel door handle of my office. "Trent is there." "Yes," Sarah whispered frantically. And they did not come alone. They brought a man with a briefcase. I saw his badge. He is a mobile notary public. Nora, your grandfather can barely keep his eyes open, and your brother is standing over his bed right now, trying to physically force him to sign a stack of legal documents. You have to stop them. I dropped the burner phone onto my desk, snatched my car keys, and sprinted out the door. The drive to City General Hospital was an absolute blur of neon traffic lights and screeching tires. I broke every speed limit, my knuckles white against the leather steering wheel. Trent was not just trying to steal a fortune tonight. He was actively terrorizing a dying man to do it. The sheer desperation of bringing a mobile notary into an intensive care unit proved that the Cayman Island transfer was stalling, or Nia had realized the check I held was a ticking time bomb. They needed an alternate legal route to seize Henry's assets before the federal freeze locked them out forever. A newly signed power of attorney or a hastily revised will would give Nia the ammunition she needed to bypass the flagged routing number. I slammed my car into a loading zone near the emergency room entrance, ignored the shouting valet, and sprinted through the sliding glass doors. I bypassed the crowded waiting room, taking the stairwell 2 steps at a time to reach the 4th-floor cardiology wing. My lungs burned with the exertion, but the adrenaline masked the pain. The heavy double doors of the intensive care unit loomed at the end of the sterile, brightly lit hallway. But I was not going to be able to just walk right in. Standing squarely in front of the restricted access doors were my parents. Richard stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute contempt. Beatrice hovered beside him, clutching her designer handbag like a shield, her eyes darting nervously down the corridor. They were standing guard. Trent had deployed them to ensure he had uninterrupted access to a defenseless old man. They were willing accomplices to a massive fraud prioritizing their son's wealth over their own father's life. I did not slow my pace. I marched straight toward them, my heels clicking sharply against the linoleum. "Move out of my way," I demanded, keeping my voice low but hard. Richard stepped forward, physically blocking the electronic sensor pad required to open the doors. He looked me up and down with utter disgust, sneering at my slightly disheveled appearance. "Scum isn't allowed near him," Richard spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and panic. "You have done enough damage to this family tonight. Trent is handling the medical directives. You are going to turn around and walk out of this hospital before I have security drag you out in handcuffs." I stepped right into his personal space, refusing to back down or show an ounce of fear. "He is having a stroke," I shot back. "He needs medical care, not a legal shakedown. You both know exactly what Trent is doing in there. He is stealing the estate, and you are letting him do it." Beatrice stepped out from behind my father, her face a mask of calculated cruelty. She reached out and grabbed my wrist, her manicured fingernails digging painfully into my skin. "We know exactly what you are doing, Nora," she whispered venomously. "Nia called us from the bank. We know you stole that check, and we know that bank manager slipped you something else before you fled like a coward. You are trying to frame your brother because you are jealous of his success." I yanked my arm out of her grasp. My mother smoothed her expensive blouse, completely unbothered by my anger. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "Here is how this works, Nora. You hand over the check. You hand over whatever little toy Gallagher gave you. You surrender the stolen property right now, and I might tell the nurses to let you look at your grandfather through the observation glass for 2 minutes. Otherwise, you will never see him alive again." The sheer evil of her ultimatum paralyzed me for a fraction of a second. She was holding a dying man hostage to protect Trent's fraudulent empire. I stared into my mother's eyes and saw absolutely nothing maternal, nothing human. There was only greed and self-preservation. She was demanding I trade the evidence of their crimes for a chance to say goodbye. I took a deliberate step backward, holding my hands up as if surrendering to their demands. "Fine," I said, keeping my voice deliberately unsteady to sell the performance. "Let me just get it out of my bag." Richard and Beatrice watched me closely, their expressions triumphant. They thought I had broken. They thought I was the same terrified 20-year-old girl they had bullied into giving up her college tuition. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Instead of unzipping my purse, I spun on my heel and bolted down the intersecting hallway to my right. Nora Richard bellowed, his heavy footsteps pounding behind me. I ignored him. I remembered the layout of the fourth floor from when I helped Sarah secure the hospital's network architecture. The main ICU doors were heavily guarded, but there was a secondary route used strictly for moving inventory. I threw my body against the heavy door of the medical supply corridor, ignoring the authorized personnel-only sign. The door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into a narrow, dimly lit passageway lined with carts of saline bags and surgical equipment. I sprinted down the corridor, dodging linen hampers and crash carts, my boots sliding on the polished floor. I reached the service exit at the far end and shoved it open, bursting directly into the center of the intensive care unit. The rhythmic beeping of heart monitors echoed in the quiet ward. I scanned the glass-walled rooms until I saw him. Room 412. Grandpa Henry lay in the center of a chaotic tangle of wires and tubes, an oxygen mask strapped over his pale, sunken face. His eyes were half open, glazed, and unseeing. Standing directly over him was Trent. A man in a cheap suit clutched a leather briefcase in the corner. Trent was holding a clipboard against my grandfather's chest, literally prying Henry's trembling fingers apart to force a heavy brass pen into his hand. "Sign it, old man," Trent hissed, his voice raw with panic. "Just sign the damn paper so we can fix this." I lunged into the room and slammed my shoulder into Trent, knocking him sideways. The brass pen flew out of his hand and clattered across the hospital floor. Trent stumbled into the rolling tray table, dropping the clipboard as he scrambled to maintain his balance. "Get your hands off him!" I screamed, stepping between my brother and the hospital bed. Trent recovered instantly, his eyes burning with absolute malice. Before he could retaliate, the rhythmic beeping from the machines beside the bed suddenly hitched. The steady pulse broke into a chaotic rapid flutter, and then flattened into a solid, piercing tone. The monitor flashed a blinding red warning. Grandpa Henry had flatlined. Alarms blared down the hallway. A team of doctors and nurses rushed past me, shouting for a crash cart and shoving us away from the bed to begin chest compressions. I was shoved against the glass wall, paralyzed by the horrific scene unfolding in front of me. Amidst the chaos of the medical team fighting to restart our grandfather's heart, Trent casually bent down and scooped up the clipboard from the floor. He folded the piece of paper, slipped it securely into the breast pocket of his tailored suit, and turned to look at me. He smoothed his lapels and offered a sickening, triumphant smirk. Too late, dropout. 2 days passed in a hollow, suffocating blur. The cold reality of what had transpired in that hospital room settled over me like a heavy shroud. The local newspaper published the official obituary on Sunday morning. It was a lavish, full-page spread detailing Henry's philanthropic achievements, his massive business empire, and his beloved, devoted family. It listed Richard, Beatrice, Trent, and even Nia as the grieving survivors. My name was conspicuously absent. They had legally and publicly scrubbed my existence from my grandfather's legacy, attempting to erase me from the narrative entirely. I dressed in a simple, tailored black suit and drove to the historic cathedral downtown, refusing to let their petty psychological warfare keep me from saying a final goodbye. The crisp morning air bit at my skin as I walked up the stone steps, my heels echoing in the quiet courtyard. Before I could even reach the heavy oak doors, 2 massive men in tactical black suits stepped squarely into my path. Nia emerged from the vestibule, adjusting her black designer veil. She gave the guards a curt, dismissive nod. They immediately flanked me, their massive hands hovering mere inches from my arms. "You are only here because kicking you out entirely would cause a public scene," Nia whispered, her voice laced with venom and cloying floral perfume. "But you will stay exactly where I put you." The guards marched me past the polished oak pews, past the towering floral arrangements, costing more than a luxury car, all the way to the absolute rear of the cathedral. They did not stop at the back row of family seating. They forced me behind the velvet ropes, gesturing to a row of folding chairs set up in the drafty vestibule shadows. I was seated next to the catering staff, the coat check attendants, and the valet drivers. It was a calculated, deliberate humiliation, designed to remind me that in their eyes, I was nothing more than the hired help. I sat in the cold shadows, my spine perfectly straight, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break or cause the scene they desperately wanted to capture on camera. The cathedral swelled with hundreds of people. Business partners, politicians, and socialites had come to pay their respects to the great Henry. When the murmuring died down, Beatrice walked gracefully to the podium. She clutched a lace handkerchief, her shoulders trembling with practiced vulnerability. She leaned into the microphone, letting a single tragic sob echo through the vaulted ceilings. "My father was a pillar of unity." Beatrice began, her voice cracking with flawless theatrical precision. "He believed that blood was a sacred bond. In a world full of selfishness, he taught us that family must always stand together, protect one another, and preserve the legacy we built as one unbroken circle." Her words were a sickening parade of hypocrisy. As she waxed poetic about loyalty and unconditional love, her gaze lifted from her prepared notes and locked directly onto me, standing in the back with the staff. Through the sea of mourners, her eyes burned with undisguised hatred. She was delivering a public sermon on unity while actively executing a master plan to destroy her own daughter. The congregation wept, completely captivated by the grieving daughter routine. I just watched her analyzing her body language, her breathing, the precise moments she chose to dab her perfectly dry eyes. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime, entirely convinced she had won the war. The procession moved to the private family estate for the burial. The sprawling green lawns were dotted with white tents and black umbrellas. I remained on the perimeter, still flanked by my two personal security shadows. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and expensive lilies as the ornate mahogany casket was suspended over the open grave. The priest delivered the final blessings, and the polished brass crank began to turn, slowly lowering my grandfather into the ground. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the estate. As the crowd began to disperse toward the catered reception tents, Trent broke away from the front row. He adjusted his dark sunglasses and walked purposefully in my direction. My guards parted slightly, allowing him to step right up to my shoulder. He did not look at me directly, keeping his face angled toward the gathering crowd, so anyone watching would assume he was offering a brotherly word of comfort. "You have exactly 1 hour to clear out of your apartment," Trent stated, his voice a flat, deadpan drone. I blinked, turning my head to look at his sharp profile. "What are you talking about?" Trent finally turned his head, pulling his sunglasses down slightly, so I could see the malicious glee dancing in his eyes. "Your pathetic little brick building on the edge of town," he whispered. "The landlord was drowning in debt. I bought the entire property yesterday afternoon through a shell company. I terminated your lease this morning for a severe violation of building codes. The demolition crew arrives tomorrow at dawn to level the entire block. You are homeless, Nora." I stared at him, my mind racing as the tactical brilliance of their strike became clear. They were trying to completely destabilize me. They had frozen my public bank accounts, launched a smear campaign claiming I was violently psychotic, erased me from the family obituary, and now they were making me homeless. They wanted me on the streets, panicked, broke, and desperate, entirely too busy fighting for basic survival to interfere with their theft of the estate. More importantly, my custom server rack and the physical core of Apex Cyber Defense were sitting inside that apartment. If I did not extract my hardware and scrub the location immediately, Trent's demolition crew would bury my operation under tons of rubble. "You are out of moves," Trent continued, straightening his tie with a smug grin. "You have 60 minutes to pack your cheap thrift store clothes before my private security team changes the locks. Run along now." Trent turned on his heel and sauntered back toward the main pavilion, where waiters were already distributing flutes of champagne. I watched him go, my pulse steadying into a slow, rhythmic drumbeat. He thought he had severed my lifeline, completely unaware that his Midnight Cayman Islands transfer was currently sitting in a federal freeze triggered by his own grandfather. Before I could turn and race back to my car to salvage my servers, the harsh feedback of a microphone screeching echoed across the manicured lawn. The muted chatter of the wealthy guests halted instantly. Standing at a podium near the main estate doors was Mr. Caldwell. He was Henry's longtime attorney, the man who had supposedly guarded the family trust for decades. But as I looked at his sweaty brow and the nervous way he clutched a thick leather binder, I knew instantly that Nia had compromised him. Caldwell cleared his throat, his voice projecting awkwardly over the large outdoor speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption during this solemn moment," Caldwell announced, his eyes darting toward Trent and Nia, who stood expectantly at the front of the crowd. Per the family's explicit request, and given the complex nature of the corporate holdings, the reading of the will shall take place immediately in the estate's boardroom. The transition from the damp earth of the burial site to the suffocating opulence of the estate's corporate boardroom was a silent, heavily guarded march. The family compound housed a dedicated executive wing, a fortress of dark mahogany paneling, leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray, churning harbor. Trent strutted at the head of our grim procession, his arm draped possessively around Nia's waist, as if he already held the deed to the very floorboards we walked on. Beatrice and Richard followed closely behind, flanked by the same tactical security personnel who had kept me pinned in the shadows at the cathedral. The guards directed me to a single uncomfortable wooden chair, positioned at the extreme far end of the massive table, physically and symbolically isolating me from the plush leather executive seats my family eagerly claimed for themselves. Mr. Caldwell stood at the head of the room, looking less like a prestigious family attorney and more like a man about to face a military firing squad. He continuously dabbed his gleaming, sweat-beaded forehead with a silk handkerchief as his trembling fingers keyed his laptop. A massive digital projector hummed to life above us, casting the image of a dense legal document onto the wall-sized smart screen behind him. The date at the top of the PDF glared down at me in stark, bold font. It was dated exactly 3 days ago, the exact day my grandfather had slipped me the warning check before his stroke. Caldwell cleared his throat, adjusting his tie and avoiding my gaze entirely. He began to read the heavily redacted legalese in a rushed, monotonous drone. The bottom line of the document was devastatingly simple, yet breathtaking in its audacity. The previous trusts, the carefully balanced corporate distributions my grandfather had spent decades structuring to protect the company, were completely dissolved. In their place stood a sweeping unilateral transfer of absolute power. 100% of the estate's liquid assets, the international property deeds, the luxury vehicles, and the controlling voting shares of the family corporation were bequeathed directly and solely to Trent. My brother had not just stolen the money to cover his catastrophic corporate losses. He had legally crowned himself king of an untouchable financial empire. Trent leaned back in his high-backed chair, steepling his fingers together as he surveyed his newly conquered kingdom. He shot a smug, triumphant glance at our parents, who were nodding with solemn, manufactured reverence. They actually pretended to believe this was Grandpa Henry's dying wish. Or worse, they knew it was a total fabrication and simply did not care so long as the immense wealth remained tightly in the hands of the Golden Son, who funded their country club memberships and luxury vacations. Caldwell's voice continued to drone on, listing offshore accounts and subsidiary holdings, every single asset funneling directly into Trent's personal accounts. It was a flawless corporate coup executed with ruthless, undeniable precision. But Nia was not satisfied with merely taking the money. As the architect of this fraud, she needed to ensure I was permanently neutralized legally and socially destroyed so I could never contest the theft in a court of law. Caldwell's voice wavered noticeably as he reached the final page of the projected document. He took a shaky sip of water from the crystal glass on his podium and read the final damning clause. "To my granddaughter Nora," he read, his voice dropping to a harsh, uncomfortable whisper in the cavernous room, "I leave absolutely nothing. Due to her severe mental instability, her erratic and violent behavior, and her prolonged estrangement from this family, she is explicitly disinherited from any and all claims to this estate, both current and future. Furthermore, any attempt she makes to contest this document or its validity shall be viewed as a direct symptom of her ongoing psychiatric decline." Beatrice let out a soft, highly theatrical sigh, pressing a trembling hand to her chest, as if the words physically wounded her delicate sensibilities. "It is just so tragic," my mother murmured, looking around the table to ensure the security guards and the compromised lawyer were witnessing her maternal grief. My father shook his head in heavy disgust, glaring at me from across the vast expanse of polished mahogany. "Henry knew you were too sick to handle real money, Nora," Richard stated, his voice laced with cold, absolute finality. "He saw what you have become. A paranoid, delusional dropout. He drafted this to protect the family legacy from your toxic influence." I sat perfectly still, keeping my face entirely blank. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not give them the satisfaction of the emotional breakdown they were trying to provoke. Nia watched me closely, her dark eyes glittering with predatory, unyielding triumph. She stood up from her chair, her designer heels sinking into the thick carpet, and walked slowly down the length of the table toward me. She reached into the pocket of her tailored blazer, pulled out a crisp white envelope, and tossed it carelessly onto the table. It slid across the polished wood, stopping mere inches from my folded hands. I opened the envelope with slow, deliberate movements. Inside was a cashier's check made out to my name. The amount was exactly $10,000. I looked up at my sister-in-law, raising a single unimpressed eyebrow. Nia leaned over the table, placing her hands flat on the wood and bringing her face uncomfortably close to mine. "We are not entirely heartless, Nora," she whispered, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "Take it. Trent is feeling generous today. It is enough for a one-way bus ticket and a down payment on a cheap, rusted-out trailer in a state where no one knows your face or your pathetic history." Nia tapped a long, perfectly manicured fingernail against the check. "Your apartment building is coming down tomorrow morning," she reminded me smoothly. "Your bank accounts are entirely frozen. Your reputation is completely incinerated. You have no money, no home, and no family left to manipulate. If you walk out of this room right now and disappear forever, you can keep the 10 grand. If you try to fight us, I will personally see to it that you are committed to a locked psychiatric facility by the end of the week. Now take the money and crawl back into the hole you came from." Trent chuckled from the far end of the room, raising a heavy glass of bourbon in a mock toast to my demise. My parents looked away, completely washing their hands of my existence. I looked down at the $10,000 check. Then I looked up past Nia's smug, triumphant face, staring directly at the massive digital projection of the newly minted will glowing on the wall. I did not flinch. I pushed my chair back and stood up, the legs scraping loudly against the floorboards. I picked up the check, tore it precisely in half, and let the pieces flutter to the carpet. "That is a beautiful forgery, Nia. But you made a fatal flaw in the metadata." I stepped toward the head of the mahogany table, completely ignoring the immediate bristling of the security guards flanking me. I pointed a single steady finger directly at the massive smart screen projecting the PDF. "Look at the digital signature registry in the top right corner. The embedded timestamp logs the final keystroke of authorization at exactly 11:42 last night." Nia's dark eyes flicked to the screen, a microscopic twitch of her jaw, the only sign of her sudden, creeping unease. Caldwell swallowed hard, his hands trembling violently as he instinctively reached out to close his laptop. I slammed my hand down on the table, the sharp crack of my palm against the wood freezing him in place. "At 11:42 last night," I continued, my voice echoing in the dead-silent boardroom. "Our grandfather was in the intensive care unit. He had just suffered a massive, catastrophic stroke. I know this with absolute certainty because I was standing right outside his glass room. He was already intubated, heavily sedated, and completely unresponsive. He was physically incapable of breathing on his own, let alone holding a brass pen, reviewing complex corporate legal documents, or providing coherent consent." Beatrice scoffed loudly, waving a dismissive hand covered in diamond rings. "You are making things up again, Nora. We were all there. Your father and I spoke to him. He was perfectly lucid until the very end." I turned my gaze to my mother, stripping away any remaining facade of daughterly respect. "You are lying, and the hospital network records will prove it. Every monitor in that ICU is hardwired to a central server that logs a patient's vitals down to the millisecond. I have already secured a mirrored, encrypted copy of those raw logs. When a federal judge subpoenas the hospital's data architecture and compares it to the timestamp on Nia's fraudulent PDF, They will see that Henry's blood oxygen and brain activity were at critical failure levels. You did not get his signature. You held a dying man's hand and traced his name while his heart was stopping. The room temperature seemed to plummet. Caldwell looked like he was about to vomit directly onto his expensive leather loafers. Nia's pristine mask of arrogance fractured, replaced by a cold, calculating glare as her mind raced to assess her sudden legal exposure. She knew I had just trapped her in a federal felony. But Trent simply threw his head back and laughed. It was a booming, arrogant sound that shattered the tension in the room. He pushed his chair back, stood up, and casually walked over to Caldwell's podium. He snatched the physical paper copy of the will from the lawyer's trembling hands. "Are you going to arrest me with your imaginary tech skills?" Trent mocked, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. He held the document up and deliberately, theatrically tore it straight down the middle. He placed the two halves together and tore them again, letting the shredded pieces of heavy stock paper fall like snow over the boardroom carpet. "Metadata," Trent sneered, shaking his head as if I were a delusional child throwing a tantrum. "You watch too many movies, Nora. You think anyone cares about digital timestamps? I have the best legal team in the state. I have the entire board of directors in my pocket. You have absolutely nothing. You have no money, no lawyer, and no proof." He stepped closer to me, his chest puffed out, radiating the unearned confidence of a man who had never faced a real consequence in his entire life. "You are a broke, unstable dropout who just got evicted." Trent spat, jabbing a finger toward the heavy oak doors. "Get out of my building. You have exactly 1 hour before my crew throws your junk into the alley." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the shredded pieces of the fake will on the floor, then down at the halves of the $10,000 check I had just torn. I reached down, picked up the 2 pieces of the check from the table, and held them up right in front of Trent's face. I ripped them one more time straight down the center, reducing Nia's insulting bribe to worthless confetti. I walked over to where Trent had been sitting and dropped the shredded pieces directly into his half-full mug of expensive black coffee. "I don't need your building, Trent," I said, my voice dropping to a dead, absolute calm. "I already own the servers it runs on." Trent's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, his brow furrowing as his brain struggled to process the threat. Before he could formulate a response, I turned my back on the entire room. I walked past my glaring parents, past a seething Nia, and straight through the heavy mahogany doors. The security guards did not try to stop me. I left them standing in the opulent silence of their stolen boardroom, the first seeds of genuine paranoia finally taking root in their minds. I did not wait for the valet. I power-walked down the long, winding driveway of the estate, my mind already 10 steps ahead. Trent had given me a 60-minute window before his demolition crew arrived at my apartment building. I had to secure my physical hardware. They thought I was rushing home to pack cheap clothes and thrift store furniture. They had no idea they were about to bulldoze the nerve center of a classified cybersecurity firm. I reached my car, threw it into gear, and sped back toward the city limits. The drive took exactly 22 minutes. I pulled into the alleyway behind my unassuming brick building and engaged the biometric locks on the rear security door. I bypassed my fake living room entirely and headed straight down the narrow hallway to my reinforced home office. The heavy steel core door clicked open and the humming lights of my command center flared to life. The 4 massive curved monitors glowed with the dormant power of my server racks. I did not have time to dismantle the entire rig. I had designed Apex Cyber Defense to be fully mobile in the event of a physical breach. I engaged the rapid purge protocol on the secondary drives, wiping all localized data and transferring the core architecture to my encrypted cloud network. Then I reached into my purse. My fingers brushed past my car keys and closed around the cold, heavy weight of the titanium USB drive. Gallagher, the terrified bank manager, had risked his life and his career to slip this drive into my hand before Nia's temporary restraining order froze everything. He knew something I didn't. He had seen the financial abyss Trent was creating, and he had given me the key to blow it wide open. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and plugged the titanium drive into the primary secure port of my workstation. I expected a standard directory to pop up a list of financial ledgers or hidden banking routing numbers. Instead, all four of my monitors instantly went black. The cooling fans in my server rack roared to life, spinning at maximum capacity as a massive unrecognized program hijacked my operating system. Bypassing every military-grade firewall I had built, a single glowing white text box appeared in the absolute dead center of the primary screen. A blinking cursor waited patiently beside two words, "Enter cipher." The blinking cursor taunted me from the center of the pitch-black screen. The cooling fans of my server rack roared like a jet engine in the cramped, windowless room, a harsh reminder that time was rapidly running out. Trent had given me exactly 60 minutes before his private demolition crew arrived to rip this building apart, burying my hardware under tons of pulverized brick and steel. I had already burned through 25 minutes just getting here and initiating the cloud backups. I stared at the glowing prompt, my hands hovering over the mechanical keyboard. Gallagher had handed me this titanium drive in a state of absolute terror, knowing it held the key to the entire financial conspiracy. But he had not given me the password. I needed to think logically. I needed to think like a panicked bank manager. Or better yet, I needed to think like the man who had orchestrated this entire dead man's switch. Grandpa Henry. I typed in Henry's birth date, formatting it as an 8-digit numerical string. I hit the enter key. The screen flashed a violent, blinding crimson. Authentication failed. 2 attempts remaining. My heart slammed against my ribs. A brute force hacking algorithm was useless here. The titanium drive was equipped with a localized self-destruct protocol. I knew the architecture of these military-grade devices. They did not just lock you out after failed attempts. They triggered an internal thermal surge that physically melted the flash memory chips into useless slag. I took a slow, deep breath to steady my shaking hands. I typed the founding year of the family corporation, the year Henry always claimed was the proudest moment of his life. I pressed enter. The crimson flash illuminated the dark room again, bathing my face in red light. Authentication failed. Final attempt. Secure wipe protocol armed. Panic threatened to overwhelm my focus. If this drive melted down, Trent and Nia won. Their forged power of attorney would hold up in probate court, the estate would be liquidated, and I would be left fighting a multi-billion-dollar legal machine with absolutely nothing but my word. I closed my eyes, blocking out the roar of the servers and the ticking clock in my head. I had to reconstruct the timeline. Henry had slipped me a warning. He had used a specific vehicle to deliver that warning right before his stroke silenced him forever. I ripped open my leather tote bag and frantically dug through the side pocket. My fingers closed around the crumpled, folded piece of paper I had shoved in there yesterday. I pulled out the hastily made photocopy of the cashier's check Henry had given me at the bank. It was the document that had triggered this entire chain of events. I smoothed the wrinkled paper flat against my desk, studying the black ink under the harsh glow of the monitors. $900,000. I looked at the MICR line printed along the bottom edge of the check, the routing number, the account number, the check number. Henry had deliberately handed me this specific financial instrument. He was a man who communicated in numbers and ledgers, in calculated corporate maneuvers. It was not just a bribe to leave town. It was a cryptographic key hiding in plain sight. I placed my fingers back onto the keyboard. I stared at the strings of numbers on the photocopy. I typed the 9-digit bank routing number, followed immediately by the $900,000 amount, omitting the commas and the decimal points. An unbroken string of raw, specific financial data. I hovered my finger over the enter key. If I was wrong, the internal battery of the USB would detonate the memory core. I pressed down. The screen hung in absolute agonizing stillness for 3 seconds. Then the crimson warning text vanished, replaced by a soothing, vibrant green progress bar that shot across the screen. Decryption successful, access granted. The black screen instantly shattered into a chaotic mosaic of digital folders expanding across all 4 of my curved monitors. The root directory was a staggering, unredacted autopsy of Trent and Nia's shadow empire. I began clicking through the master spreadsheets, my eyes darting across columns of offshore banking ledgers, shell company registrations, and falsified vendor invoices. The sheer scale of their operation was breathtaking. Trent had not simply been stealing from the family trust to fund his lavish lifestyle. He had been actively bleeding the company dry, laundering millions of dollars through a network of dummy corporations headquartered in Panama and the Cayman Islands. Nia's digital signature was embedded in every single illicit wire transfer. She was the architect of the entire laundering apparatus, moving the stolen capital through international loopholes, while Trent played the arrogant, untouchable frontman in Boston. They had systematically embezzled a fortune, preparing to drain the final liquid assets the moment Henry died. The gigabytes of irrefutable data sitting on my screens were enough to send both my brother and my sister-in-law to federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. Amidst the sprawling sea of financial ruin, a single media file caught my eye. It was sitting isolated on the desktop interface, flagged with a master administrative lock. It was undeletable, hard-coded directly into the root architecture of the titanium drive. I dragged the file to my primary monitor and double-clicked. A high-definition video player launched, filling the screen. The footage was crisp and perfectly lit. The background was immediately recognizable. It was the private wood-paneled study of Henry's estate, filmed long before he was ever confined to a hospital bed. Sitting in the center of the frame was Grandpa Henry. He was not the frail, dying man hooked up to oxygen machines and heart monitors. He was wearing his immaculate charcoal suit, his posture rigid and commanding, his eyes sharp and burning with calculated intensity. He looked powerful, dangerous, and entirely in control of his faculties. Sitting directly beside him was a stern, older man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. I recognized him instantly from my cybersecurity contracts with the government. It was Honorable Marcus Vance, a highly respected federal district court judge. Henry leaned forward, staring directly into the camera lens, cutting through time and death to speak directly to me. "If you are watching this, Nora, it means Trent took the bait," Henry stated, his voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. I knew he was bleeding the corporate accounts dry. I watched him build his shadow empire with Nia. But proving a money laundering operation of that staggering magnitude requires a fatal, undeniable error on his part. I could not just accuse him. I needed him arrogant. I needed him to firmly believe he had won. I needed him to forge my signature on federal banking documents and legally bind himself to the stolen assets. I needed him to hang himself. All the irrefutable evidence you need is encrypted on this drive. Hand it directly to Judge Vance. Finish this. 1 week later, the Grand Continental Hotel ballroom was a towering monument to stolen wealth. Giant crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the city's elite. Waiters in crisp white gloves circulated with silver trays of beluga caviar and vintage champagne. Tonight was the official shareholder gala, the highly publicized coronation of Trent as the new CEO of the family empire, culminating in the launch of a massive new public offering. It was a lavish victory lap built entirely on fraud. Outside the hotel, sitting in the back of a rented black vehicle, I adjusted the cuffs of my suit. For 27 years, my family had defined me as the disheveled, unremarkable dropout. They had expected me to show up tonight, if I showed up at all, looking exactly like the desperate, broken victim they had engineered. But that terrified girl died the moment Trent tore up Nia's insulting check. I stepped out of the vehicle wearing a breathtaking, razor-sharp designer suit in deep emerald silk. The tailoring was flawless, acting as armor forged from fabric and thread. My hair was swept back into a sleek, commanding style, and a pair of diamond studs rested at my ears. I was completely shedding the ugly dropout aesthetic forever. I looked like the CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech firm. I looked like a woman who held the execution switch to an entire empire. Security at the venue was exceptionally tight. Trent had hired an elite private firm and explicitly instructed them to keep me out, plastering my old college ID photo across their watch lists. Walking through the front door required a verified digital credential. Luckily, the Grand Continental used a centralized biometric and RFID security grid. It was a robust system, but my firm Apex Cyber Defense had audited the manufacturer's back-end architecture 18 months ago. We had found a zero-day vulnerability in their localized handshake protocol. I pulled out my phone, launched a custom decryption app I had compiled over the weekend, and pinged the hotel's localized server. Within seconds, I bypassed the guest registry firewall. I intercepted the data packet for a Tier 1 VIP credential and wirelessly cloned the encrypted signature onto a blank hotel keycard in my pocket. The entire infiltration took less than 40 seconds. I walked gracefully up the marble steps to the main ballroom entrance. Two massive guards flanked the velvet ropes, their eyes scanning the crowd. I handed my cloned card to the chief attendant. He tapped it against his scanner. The machine chirped a pleasant welcoming tone and the screen flashed a solid green light. "Right this way, ma'am," he said, stepping aside and pulling back the rope. They were looking for a terrified, broke outcast. They completely ignored the apex predator walking right past them. The ballroom smelled of expensive orchids and unchecked greed. I glided through the sea of shareholders and wealthy investors, my heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor. I spotted my parents immediately. Richard and Beatrice were holding court near an ice sculpture, clinking champagne flutes with city councilmen and bragging about Trent's brilliant corporate vision. They looked so incredibly smug, entirely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was rigged with digital explosives. At the front of the room, a massive stage had been erected, flanked by two towering screens displaying the family company's new logo. The string quartet faded into silence as the spotlight hit the center microphone. Trent walked onto the stage, soaking up the thunderous applause. He wore a custom tuxedo radiating absolute arrogance. Nia stood in the front row, clapping adoringly, her eyes shining with the thrill of stolen power. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Trent began, his voice booming smoothly through the surround sound speakers. He gripped the edges of the mahogany podium, leaning forward with practiced sincerity. "Tonight we celebrate more than just a new public offering. We celebrate the legacy of my grandfather Henry. He built this empire on the pillars of integrity, family, and unwavering trust. As your new CEO, I promise to carry that sacred torch forward." The hypocrisy was physically nauseating. I stepped out from the shadows of the peripheral pillars and walked directly into the wide center aisle of the ballroom. The bright staging lights spilled over the crowd, catching the sharp lines of my emerald suit. I did not stop walking until I stood dead center, roughly 30 feet from the edge of the stage. Trent was mid-sentence when his gaze swept over the audience and locked onto mine. The words died in his throat. His perfectly capped smile faltered, dropping into an expression of raw, unadulterated shock. He blinked, staring at the polished, commanding woman standing in the aisle, struggling to reconcile my appearance with the shattered victim he thought he had buried a week ago. The silence stretched, becoming awkward and heavy as the shareholders murmured, following Trent's frozen stare. Nia turned around, her jaw dropping open as she realized the security perimeter had failed completely. Trent's shock instantly mutated into explosive rage. The polished CEO facade vanished, revealing the vicious, panicking boy underneath. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me, his voice cracking through the microphone. "Security!" He bellowed, the sound echoing harshly off the crystal chandeliers. "Throw this trespasser out immediately. She is a known threat. Remove her from my hotel." Two guards at the edge of the stage stepped forward, their hands reaching for their radios. But before they could descend the steps, the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom slammed open. A dozen men and women wearing tactical windbreakers, emblazoned with federal agency logos, poured into the room, fanning out to secure every exit. The head of Trent's private security detail, a towering man with a coiled earpiece, stepped quickly onto the stage. Trent glared at him, his face flushed with panicked fury. "I said throw her out," Trent hissed, gesturing frantically toward me. The security chief did not look at me. He walked right up to Trent, reached behind his own ear, and deliberately unplugged his earpiece. "Sorry, sir. We just received orders from federal authorities. Nobody leaves this room." The heavy oak doors of the Grand Continental Ballroom echoed with a resounding metallic clack as the federal agents engaged the deadbolts. The security chief took a deliberate step back from the podium, crossing his arms over his chest and leaving Trent completely exposed under the blinding stage lights. The perfectly orchestrated illusion of the family empire was fracturing in real time. I did not hesitate. I bypassed the frozen security guards, my emerald silk suit catching the light as I marched directly up the center aisle. The audience of elite shareholders and wealthy socialites parted like the Red Sea, their champagne flutes lowering as confusion rippled through the crowd. I reached the main audiovisual control console situated at the base of the stage. The hotel's lead technician, a young man wearing a headset and a terrified expression, took one look at the federal windbreakers securing the perimeter and wisely backed away from the soundboard with his hands raised in surrender. I pulled a customized interface cable from my pocket. I plugged one end into my heavily encrypted mobile device and slammed the other directly into the primary presentation terminal. With 3 rapid keystrokes, I executed a system override. The massive LED screens towering behind Trent had been projecting the pristine focus group-tested logo of the family corporation. Without warning, the corporate blue background violently glitched. The screens went pitch black for a fraction of a second before exploding into a cascading waterfall of raw digital data. It was a live, unredacted mirror of the decrypted titanium drive Grandpa Henry had left me. Columns of stark white text scrolled at breakneck speed across the massive monitors. The entire room watched as highly classified banking ledgers were broadcast in high definition. Cayman Islands, Panama, the Seychelles. The screens displayed exact offshore routing numbers, shell company aliases, and massive wire transfer sums moving in real time. Every single illegal transaction, every embezzled dollar, every falsified vendor invoice was laid bare for the city's financial elite to read. The harsh glow of the undeniable proof illuminated Trent's pale, sweat-slicked face, casting long shadows across his custom tuxedo. I walked up the short staircase to the stage. Trent was paralyzed, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the financial autopsy of his life scrolling behind him. I reached out and casually plucked the wireless microphone from his limp, trembling fingers. He offered absolutely no resistance. I turned my back on my brother and faced the sea of investors. Ladies and gentlemen, my voice echoed through the cavernous hall, carrying absolute, unwavering authority over the state-of-the-art sound system. You are not investing in a tech company. You are investing in a sophisticated money-laundering shell run by the CFO Trent and shielded by his wife Nia. The ballroom erupted. The polite, muted whispers of the upper crust instantly dissolved into a chaotic, deafening roar of outrage and absolute panic. Men in expensive suits dropped their drinks, the crystal shattering against the marble floors. High-profile investors scrambled to pull out their phones, frantically dialing their brokers and legal teams as they realized their millions were tied up in a massive, federal-level criminal enterprise. The ambient noise in the room swelled into a frantic, terrified frenzy. Down in the front row, Beatrice leaped from her plush velvet chair, her composure completely shattered. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream, her hands flying to her face as the horrific reality set in. Her social standing, her infinite wealth, her country club prestige was evaporating into thin air before her very eyes. She was suddenly just a woman watching her golden child's criminal empire burn to ash on a public stage. Richard reacted with pure violent desperation. His face contorted with rage as he charged the stage, ignoring the federal agents moving in from the perimeter. He lunged directly for the AV console, his eyes wild as he sought to physically sever the connection and stop the hemorrhage of data. He dove toward the tangled mess of thick black cables powering the projector system, his hands grasping frantically for the primary data cord. I anticipated the move before his knees even hit the floor. I stepped forward, bringing the razor-sharp heel of my designer shoe down hard on the thickest part of the cable bundle. I pinned the cord immovably against the polished stage floorboards, locking it securely in place. Richard yanked at the wires, his face turning an ugly shade of crimson as he panted and strained, but the connection refused to budge. He looked up at me from his knees, his expression a pathetic mixture of fury and absolute defeat. I simply looked down at him, my posture perfectly rigid, entirely unmoved by his panic. Nia realized the inescapable reality of the ledger scrolling behind her. The calculated icy facade she used to manipulate and terrorize people completely dissolved. She yanked her phone from her designer clutch, pushing her way to the edge of the stage. Her perfectly manicured finger jabbed furiously in my direction. She was losing her mind, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated panic as she tried to salvage a situation that was already fatal. "This is defamation!" Naya shrieked, her voice cutting through the roar of the crowd. "I will sue you for every penny." I did not flinch at her empty threats. I stood perfectly still under the bright stage lights, listening to the frantic shouts of the investors and the heavy footsteps of federal agents moving down the aisles to secure their targets. I let Nia scream until her lungs burned, watching the woman who had tried to erase my existence unravel completely in front of the entire city. I offered her a cold, utterly serene smile. I raised the microphone back to my lips, my voice slicing effortlessly through the chaos of the room. "You can't sue the federal government, Nia. Look at the screen." I tapped the screen of my phone, executing the next command sequence. The dizzying cascade of offshore bank ledgers instantly vanished from the twin LED screens towering above the stage. The chaotic, deafening roar of the 500 shareholders died in the span of a single heartbeat. A heavy, suffocating silence slammed down over the grand ballroom as the monitors flickered and stabilized. A high-definition video feed filled the massive screens. It was the file from the titanium drive. Grandpa Henry sat in his private study looking fiercely alive. His posture radiated the terrifying authority that had built our family empire from the ground up. Sitting right beside him was Honorable Marcus Vance, the federal judge. Henry leaned forward. When he spoke, his voice boomed through the ballroom's state-of-the-art surround sound system. The acoustics were perfect. It sounded as if the patriarch had risen from the grave to deliver his final judgment in person. To the board of directors and the shareholders of this corporation, Henry began, his eyes boring a hole directly into the camera lens. "For the past 6 months, I have been conducting a covert audit of our internal financials. I have uncovered a sophisticated systemic embezzlement operation designed to bankrupt this company from the inside out." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Trent staggered backward on the stage, his hands gripping the mahogany podium as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from beneath him. "The architects of this treason are my own grandson Trent and his wife Nia." Henry continued, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "They have spent years siphoning capital into offshore shell companies, manipulating ledgers, and betraying the fundamental trust of this institution. Trent is a thief. He is a disgrace to our name and entirely unfit to manage a single cent of this estate. Furthermore, I have submitted medical affidavits to Judge Vance, proving that any document bearing my signature during my final hospitalization is a forgery." Nia traced my hand while I was incapacitated. "It is a federal felony." Down in the front row, Nia let out a strangled, breathless sound. She stumbled back against a chair, her face draining of all color as she stared at the 50-foot projection of the man she thought she had successfully murdered. "Because I anticipated they would attempt a hostile takeover upon my passing," Henry stated, gesturing to the federal judge sitting beside him. "I brought Judge Vance here to witness and authenticate my true, final, and legally binding will and testament. I am completely voiding all previous documents, powers of attorney, and corporate successions." The silence in the room was so absolute you could hear the soft hum of the stage lights. Everyone was paralyzed, trapped in the gravitational pull of Henry's final decree. "I leave 100% of my voting shares, the controlling interest of the corporation, and my entire personal estate to my brilliant granddaughter Nora." Henry smiled, a rare, genuine expression of pride that made my throat tighten. "She is the only one in this family with the intellect, the foresight, and the integrity to save what I have built. She built her cybersecurity firm from nothing. She has the exact ruthless precision this company needs to survive. She has my absolute blessing to purge this company of its rot. Burn them down, Nora. The video cut to black. The screens powered down. For 2 full seconds, the ballroom remained frozen. Then the meltdown hit like a shockwave. The 500 shareholders erupted in pure, unadulterated outrage. It was a spectacular display of corporate panic. Men and women in expensive formal wear began shouting over each other, their voices combining into a deafening roar of betrayal. Cell phones were yanked from suit pockets and evening bags. Investors were frantically yelling at their brokers, screaming orders to dump their stock, freeze their capital, and pull their funding immediately. The highly publicized initial public offering was dead on arrival. In the span of 60 seconds, Trent's carefully constructed illusion collapsed entirely. I watched billions of dollars in projected valuation simply evaporate into thin air. Years of backdoor deals, manipulated stock prices, and aggressive networking were completely annihilated by a 2-minute video. The board members who had been patting Trent on the back just 15 minutes ago were now actively backing away from the stage, looking at him as if he were carrying a highly contagious plague. They were already drafting their resignation letters in their heads, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of a federal money laundering scandal. They knew the Securities and Exchange Commission would be freezing assets before midnight. Beatrice was sobbing hysterically near the shattered remains of a swan ice sculpture, her hands clutching her diamond necklace as her social standing and infinite wealth burned to ash before her eyes. Richard was surrounded by a swarm of furious investors demanding answers, his face a mask of sweating, stammering terror. He pointed uselessly toward the stage, trying to shift the blame to his son, but nobody was listening. Federal agents were moving methodically down the aisles, their tactical boots heavy against the marble. They were carrying zip ties and handcuffs, cutting off every possible exit route. Nia was backed against the velvet ropes, screaming legal threats at an impassive federal investigator. She was quoting corporate bylaws and threatening lawsuits, but her voice was shrill and cracking with the realization that she was going to spend the rest of her life in a federal penitentiary. Up on the stage, Trent was completely alone. The spotlight still beat down on him, illuminating his absolute ruin. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving under his custom tuxedo. He looked around the ballroom, watching his empire turn to dust. The money was gone. The power was gone. The legacy he had stolen was ripped from his hands and handed directly to the sister he had thrown into the street. His eyes slowly panned across the chaotic room and locked onto me. The polished, arrogant facade of the untouchable CEO shattered completely. What remained was a feral, cornered animal. His face flushed a dark, dangerous crimson, the veins bulging against the collar of his dress shirt. He was driven by absolute, unhinged rage. He had lost everything, and he blamed the woman standing in the emerald suit. Trent spun toward the podium. His hand shot out, closing around the thick, heavy neck of a massive crystal water pitcher resting next to his teleprompter notes. Ice and water sloshed over the rim, splashing onto the floorboards as he hefted the solid glass weapon. He let out a guttural, terrifying roar that cut right through the panicked shouting of the crowd. He launched himself off the edge of the stage, clearing the short staircase entirely. His dress shoes hit the marble floor with a heavy thud, and he charged directly down the center aisle, his eyes wild and murderous, hurtling straight toward me to silence me permanently. I stood perfectly still. The heavy crystal pitcher caught the harsh glare of the overhead lights as Trent raised it above his head like a club. His face was distorted into a grotesque mask of pure panic and violent intent. He crossed the distance between us in a fraction of a second, his heavy footsteps echoing like gunshots across the silent room. He expected me to cower. He expected the broken, compliant little sister he had spent his entire life bullying into submission. But I did not step back. I did not flinch or break eye contact. I knew exactly what kind of invisible net I had woven around this entire building. Before Trent could close the final 5 feet, the impeccably dressed man sitting in the front row closest to the aisle sprang into action. He was not a wealthy shareholder or a corporate board member. He was an undercover federal agent who had been tracking my brother's offshore accounts for months. The man lunged, crossing the gap with terrifying, calculated speed. He intercepted Trent mid-stride, seizing my brother by the lapels of his expensive custom tuxedo. Utilizing Trent's own reckless, unbalanced momentum against him, the agent executed a brutal pivot. He spun Trent around and slammed him face first directly into the heavy mahogany podium at the edge of the stage. The impact resonated with a sickening crack. The crystal water pitcher slipped from Trent's grasp, violently shattering against the polished marble floor and sending a spray of ice and jagged glass across the aisle. Two more agents in tactical windbreakers immediately converged on the scene. They pinned Trent's arms sharply behind his back, pressing his bruised face hard into the splintered wood of the podium. The sharp zip of heavy plastic restraints echoed through the ballroom. Trent gasped for air, his chest heaving, a thin line of blood trickling from his split lip. He looked utterly broken. The untouchable golden boy, the fraudulent king of the family empire, was finally stripped of his stolen crown in front of the very people he had tried to swindle. From the corner of my eye, I caught a sudden flash of movement. Nia had not rushed forward to help her husband. She had not screamed in protest or demanded a lawyer. She possessed the cold, calculating survival instinct of a cornered rat. Realizing the absolute severity of the trap and understanding that Trent was a completely lost cause, she abandoned him without a single second of hesitation. Their entire marriage had been a transaction built on mutual greed, and the moment that wealth was threatened, her loyalty evaporated into thin air. Nia lunged toward the VIP table where she had been sitting. She snatched up a sleek metallic briefcase resting beneath her chair. I knew exactly what was inside that case. It was the physical backup of their offshore crypto wallets. It held the digital keys to the millions of dollars they had successfully siphoned away over the years. It was a massive fortune in untraceable funds, the exact golden parachute she planned to use to vanish and start a new life under a different name. Clutching the briefcase tightly to her chest, Nia hiked up the heavy silk skirt of her designer evening gown and sprinted wildly toward the back of the ballroom. She was aiming for the secondary emergency exit, a heavy set of reinforced doors leading to a private service stairwell. It was the only exit not currently blocked by the perimeter of federal investigators. Her high heels slipped dangerously on the polished marble floor, but she caught her balance, her eyes wide with desperate, frantic energy. She was running like a woman who knew her entire life depended on reaching that door. She was 30 feet away, 20 feet, 10. I did not chase her. I did not signal the guards. I simply stood my ground and raised my left wrist. My smartwatch was tethered directly to the hotel's main security mainframe, writing the exact same cloned administrative clearance I had used to bypass the front doors. The hotel's digital architecture was completely at my mercy. I swiped across the glowing interface and tapped a single bright red command icon. The hotel's electronic emergency doors responded instantly to my override command. A heavy synchronized metallic clank echoed loudly through the back vestibule as the magnetic deadbolts slammed aggressively into their housing. Nia hit the push bar of the exit doors at full speed. Her body slammed hard against the unyielding metal frame. She bounced back, letting out a sharp cry of pain, and immediately hit the bar again. She shoved her entire body weight against the brass handles, pulling, pushing, and kicking at the doors in a state of absolute unhinged frenzy. It was entirely useless. The security override had locked the mechanisms down tight. She was completely sealed inside the narrow glass vestibule cut off from the escape stairwell and entirely visible to the entire ballroom. Realizing she was trapped, Nia slowly turned around, pressing her back against the locked glass doors. She clutched the metallic briefcase against her chest like a shield, her breathing ragged and shallow. She stared back at the 500 pairs of eyes watching her spectacular, inescapable downfall. Federal agents were already walking deliberately down the center aisle toward her, pulling out their own sets of plastic restraints. There was no bribe she could offer them. There was no legal loophole she could exploit. It was over. I looked at the woman who had helped orchestrate the hostile takeover of my family's legacy. I looked at the woman who had handed me a torn check and told me I was a worthless, unstable dropout who deserved nothing. I lifted the microphone back to my lips. My voice was calm, steady, and utterly devoid of mercy. It echoed perfectly in the silent, cavernous hall. "You locked the door on me once, Nia. Now it is my turn. Let them in." As the final syllable echoed, the grand double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom violently burst open. They did not just swing wide, they were shoved backward with such kinetic force that the heavy brass handles gouged deep dents into the plaster walls. Dozens of agents flooded the room in a perfectly coordinated wave. The stark, bold yellow lettering of the FBI and IRS, emblazoned across dark navy windbreakers, created a jarring, terrifying contrast against the sea of haute couture custom tailoring and diamond jewelry. The elite shareholders shrank back, pressing themselves against the banquet tables and overturning floral centerpieces as federal authorities secured the perimeter with ruthless practiced efficiency. The ambient panic of the room instantly transformed into a breathless, suffocating silence. Nobody dared to take a single step. A tall, broad-shouldered man with iron gray hair and an unmistakable aura of command stepped through the entrance. He wore a sharp, dark suit, a gold badge clipped to his belt, catching the harsh overhead light. He strode down the center aisle, his gaze sweeping over the frozen crowd of billionaires and socialites. He reached the front of the stage where Trent was still pinned face down against the mahogany podium, groaning and thrashing weakly against the heavy plastic zip ties binding his wrists. The lead agent did not even give my brother a second glance. He completely bypassed the bleeding, ruined CEO of the family empire. Instead, he walked directly up the short staircase, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the wood, and stopped right in front of me. He extended his hand. I met his grip with a firm, steady handshake. "Thank you for the decryption key," Director Special Agent Caldwell said, his voice carrying easily over the muted, terrified whimpers of the crowd. "Apex Cyber Defense has done the Bureau a great service today. The Financial Crimes Division has been trying to crack those offshore routing protocols for 2 solid years. Your team mapped their entire network in under 48 hours. I offered a brief professional nod. "It was our pleasure, Agent Caldwell." The titanium drive my grandfather secured provided the foundation. My engineers simply isolated the digital fingerprints and bypassed their encryption layers. Every single account they tried to hide, every shell company they registered in the Caymans, is now fully accessible to the Treasury Department. Down in the front row, my mother Beatrice let out a sharp, audible gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide and unblinking as the reality of Caldwell's words slammed into her. Richard staggered backward, bumping hard into a catering table and sending a cascade of crystal champagne flutes crashing to the floor. The color entirely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. Trent, his cheek mashed against the splintered wood of the podium, stopped struggling. His bloodshot eyes rolled up to stare at me. The realization hit him with the catastrophic force of a freight train. I was not just a disgruntled sister looking for a payout. I was not the worthless, unstable college dropout they had spent the last decade mocking at country club dinners and family holidays. I was the director of Apex Cyber Defense, the elite ghost-tier cybersecurity firm the federal government had actively contracted to audit and dismantle their criminal enterprise. Grandpa Henry had not just left me a flash drive, he had left me the exact weapon needed to annihilate them, knowing I was the only person with the expertise and the clearance to wield it. Every sneer, every rejected loan application, every time they told me my computer hobby was a pathetic waste of time flashed through the room. They had built an empire on fraud, completely unaware that the daughter they discarded had built an empire on hunting frauds exactly like them. Trent let out a pathetic, suffocated wheeze. "You," he croaked, his voice cracking with absolute defeat. "You were the contractor." I looked down at him, my expression completely impassive. "I told you I built my own company, Trent. You just never bothered to ask what it did." I turned my attention away from my brother and looked toward the back of the room. Inside the glass emergency vestibule, Nia was in a state of total frantic panic. Seeing the federal agents flooding the room, she had dropped to her knees. She had the metallic briefcase cracked open on the floor and was desperately jamming a localized formatting tool into the hard drives. Her fingers flew across a miniature keyboard as she tried to trigger a magnetic wipe, attempting to destroy the crypto keys before the agents could seize the physical ledgers. She was too late. Agent Caldwell signaled to two tactical agents stationed near the back. I tapped my smartwatch, disengaging the lockdown override. The heavy magnetic deadbolts clicked open. The agents hauled the doors wide and swarmed the small vestibule. Nia shrieked, kicking and fighting like a wildcat as the agents ripped the briefcase and the formatting tool from her manicured hands. They hauled her roughly to her feet, spinning her around and slamming her against the reinforced glass. The harsh scrape of steel handcuffs echoed through the vestibule as they locked her wrists tightly behind her back. Her designer gown was twisted and torn, her perfect hair hanging in disheveled, sweat-soaked strands across her face. "This is an illegal seizure!" Nia screamed, her voice shrill and echoing across the silent ballroom. "I know my rights. I am a licensed attorney. I will have every single one of your badges for this. You cannot touch those drives without a warrant." "Actually, we have a federal warrant signed by Judge Vance himself," Caldwell called out, holding up a thick stack of folded documents. "And as for your legal credentials, I believe that matter has already been addressed." From the shadow of the main entrance, another figure stepped forward. It was an older woman, wearing a conservative charcoal suit, her expression severe and uncompromising. She carried a leather portfolio and walked with an air of absolute, unquestionable authority. She bypassed the stunned shareholders and approached the vestibule where Nia was actively fighting against the federal agents. Nia saw the woman and instantly froze, the frantic manic energy drained right out of her body, replaced by a profound, suffocating terror. She knew exactly who this woman was. Nia Sterling. The woman said, her voice sharp and clinical. "I am Eleanor Vance, acting representative of the State Bar Disciplinary Board. We received the decrypted ledgers and the wire fraud evidence directly from Director Wilson 30 minutes ago." Nia shook her head, her breath coming in short, rapid gasps. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No, you cannot do this. I have client-attorney privilege." "You waived any right to privilege the second you utilized your legal credentials to facilitate a multi-million-dollar international money laundering syndicate," Eleanor stated coldly, opening her leather portfolio. "You forged the signature of a dying man to secure corporate control. You routed embezzled funds through shell companies using your firm's escrow accounts. You are not a lawyer, Nia. You are a criminal who used a law degree as a shield." Eleanor pulled a formal embossed document from her folder and held it up so Nia could read the bold black lettering at the top. "Nia," Eleanor continued, her voice slicing through the last shreds of my sister-in-law's dignity, "your license to practice law is revoked effective immediately." The grand double doors at the main entrance of the Grand Continental Ballroom violently burst open. They did not simply swing wide, they were shoved backward with such explosive kinetic force that the heavy brass handles gouged deep permanent dents into the pristine plaster walls. The illusion of the untouchable corporate elite was instantly shattered. Dozens of federal agents flooded the gala in a perfectly coordinated, overwhelming wave. The stark, bold yellow lettering of the FBI and the IRS emblazoned across dark navy windbreakers created a jarring, terrifying contrast against the sea of haute couture, custom tailoring, and glittering diamond jewelry. The high society crowd, accustomed to preferential treatment and absolute deference, scattered like frightened prey. Elite shareholders shrank back, pressing themselves against the banquet tables, overturning expensive floral centerpieces, and spilling crystal champagne flutes as the federal authorities secured the perimeter with ruthless, practiced efficiency. The ambient panic of the room instantly transformed into a breathless, suffocating terror. Nobody dared to take a single step toward the exits. A tall, broad-shouldered man with iron-gray hair and an unmistakable aura of command stepped through the shattered entrance. He wore a sharp, dark suit, a gold badge clipped to his belt, catching the harsh, unforgiving glare of the overhead chandeliers. He strode down the center aisle, his gaze sweeping coldly over the frozen crowd of billionaires and socialites. He marched directly toward the stage where Trent was still pinned face down against the mahogany podium by the undercover operative. Trent groaned, thrashing weakly against the heavy plastic zip ties binding his wrists. He lifted his bruised, bloodied face, expecting the lead federal agent to address him. He expected to be read his rights to be treated as the criminal mastermind, the center of the universe, the fallen king. But Special Agent Caldwell did not even give my brother a second glance. He completely bypassed the bleeding, ruined CEO of the family empire. He treated Trent like a minor obstacle, stepping smoothly around the shattered glass of the water pitcher. Caldwell walked directly up the short staircase, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the wood, and stopped right in front of me. He stood at attention and extended his right hand. I met his grip with a firm, steady handshake, entirely unbothered by the chaos unfolding around us. "Thank you for the decryption key," Director Special Agent Caldwell said, his voice carrying easily over the muted, terrified whimpers of the crowd. His tone held absolute, unwavering professional respect. Apex Cyber Defense has done the Bureau a great service today. The Financial Crimes Division has been trying to crack those offshore routing protocols for 2 solid years without success. Your team mapped their entire dark web network and bypassed their firewalls in under 48 hours. I offered a brief professional nod. "It was our pleasure, Agent Caldwell." The titanium drive my grandfather secured provided the baseline architecture. My engineers simply isolated the digital fingerprints and shredded their encryption layers. Every single shadow account, every shell company they registered in the Caymans is now fully accessible and under Treasury Department control. Down in the front row, Beatrice let out a sharp, audible gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide and unblinking as the impossible reality of Caldwell's words slammed into her mind. Richard staggered backward, bumping hard into a catering table and sending a silver tray of caviar crashing to the floor. The color entirely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly, aged, and hollow. Trent, his cheek mashed against the splintered wood of the podium, stopped struggling entirely. His bloodshot eyes rolled up to stare at me. The realization hit him with the catastrophic, world-ending force of a freight train. I was not just a disgruntled, estranged sister looking for a meager payout. I was not the worthless, unstable college dropout they had spent the last decade mocking at country club dinners and family holidays. I was the director of Apex Cyber Defense. I was the architect of the elite ghost-tier cybersecurity firm that the federal government had actively contracted to audit and dismantle their massive criminal enterprise. Grandpa Henry had not just left me a flash drive full of evidence. He had left me the exact weapon needed to annihilate them, knowing I was the absolutely only person in the world with the expertise, the intellect, and the security clearance to wield it. Every arrogant sneer, every rejected loan application, every single time they had laughed and told me my computer hobby was a pathetic, delusional waste of time, flashed through the heavy silence of the ballroom. They had built an empire on fraud, completely unaware that the daughter they had discarded like trash had built a legitimate empire on hunting frauds exactly like them. I was the apex predator, and they had walked blindly into my snare. Trent stared in absolute paralyzing horror. The polished facade of the untouchable CEO was gone, replaced by the shattered, pathetic realization that I had outplayed him on a level he could not even begin to comprehend. Meanwhile, at the back of the hall, the scene inside the locked glass emergency vestibule was reaching a fever pitch of desperation. Knowing the federal agents were now flooding the room, Nia had dropped to her knees on the cold tile. She had the metallic briefcase cracked open on the floor and was frantically jamming a localized formatting tool into the primary hard drives. Her manicured fingers flew across the miniature keyboard as she tried to trigger a magnetic wipe, desperately attempting to destroy the crypto keys before the agents could seize the physical ledgers. It was a futile, pathetic display. I tapped my smartwatch, disengaging the lockdown override. The heavy magnetic deadbolts clicked open with a loud metallic snap. A tactical agent hauled the doors wide and swarmed the small vestibule. Nia shrieked, kicking and fighting as the agent effortlessly ripped the formatting tool from her hands. He hauled her roughly to her feet, spinning her around and slamming her against the reinforced glass. The harsh scrape of steel handcuffs echoed loudly as he locked her wrists tightly behind her back. As Nia struggled against the agent, a woman wearing a conservative charcoal suit and carrying a leather portfolio stepped out from the ranks of the federal investigators. She walked with an air of absolute uncompromising authority, stopping just inches from Nia's terrified face. "Nia Sterling," the woman stated, her voice sharp, clinical, and completely devoid of mercy. "I am the acting representative of the State Bar Disciplinary Board. We received the decrypted ledgers and the wire fraud evidence directly from Director Wilson this evening. Your involvement in this international money laundering syndicate is undeniable." Nia shook her head wildly, her perfect hair hanging in disheveled, sweat-soaked strands. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No, you cannot do this." The representative did not even blink. "Nia, your license to practice law is revoked effective immediately." The crisp morning light cut through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the executive suite on the 40th floor. I stood by the door nursing a black coffee, watching a team of professional movers dismantle my brother's obnoxious aesthetic. Trent had turned the CEO's office into a garish monument to his own vanity. Gaudy gold-plated paperweights, oversized abstract portraits of himself, and absurdly expensive imported leather couches that reeked of unearned arrogance were rapidly being stuffed into heavy brown cardboard boxes. He had spent millions of company dollars transforming a place of business into a frat boy's fantasy lounge. The moving men worked with brutal efficiency, stripping the walls of his ridiculous hunting trophies and framed magazine covers. The only piece of original furniture he had kept from my grandfather's era remained firmly in the center of the room. It was a massive antique mahogany desk, scarred with decades of hard work and genuine industry. It was finally mine. I walked over and ran my hand along the polished edge of the wood, feeling the history and the immense weight of the company my grandfather had built from nothing. The rot was gone. The foundation was secure. A sharp knock on the open door broke the silence. Arthur Gallagher, the senior managing director of the family's primary bank, stood in the doorway carrying a sleek leather briefcase. He had always been one of the few men on the board who possessed genuine integrity, quietly despising Trent's reckless spending, but strictly bound by his fiduciary duty to the sitting CEO. Today he looked decades younger, a visible weight completely lifted from his shoulders. He walked in and extended his hand. I shook it firmly, gesturing for him to take one of the remaining guest chairs. "The transfer protocols are absolutely complete, Nora," he said, opening the briefcase and setting a thick stack of finalized legal documents on the mahogany desk. "The frozen assets have been formally seized by federal authorities to cover the massive penalties and restitution. However, the legitimate operational capital has been fully routed into the Apex Cyber Defense holding accounts. You have absolute undisputed control of the corporate treasury. The board held an emergency session at dawn. You have been unanimously ratified as the new chief executive officer." I signed the final release forms with a smooth, practiced motion, pushing the paperwork back across the desk. "Thank you, Arthur. Your discretion and efficiency over these past 48 hours have been invaluable. We have a lot of structural damage to repair, but the bleeding has stopped." He offered a small, knowing smile as he packed away the documents. "It was the least I could do after watching your family run Henry's magnificent legacy into the ground. They treated this company like an endless ATM." Before he closed his briefcase, he hesitated, his professional demeanor softening. He reached into a hidden compartment and pulled out a small sealed envelope made of heavy cream-colored parchment. He handed it to me, carefully holding it as if it were incredibly fragile. "Henry left this in my personal vault 5 years ago with very specific, unbreakable instructions. I was only to give it to you on the exact day you officially took the company back." Arthur gave a respectful nod and exited the office, closing the heavy oak door behind him and leaving me in absolute privacy. I stared at the envelope resting in my hands. My name was written across the front in my grandfather's unmistakable sharp handwriting. My heart gave a strange, heavy thump. I broke the wax seal and unfolded the thick parchment. The ink was slightly faded from time, but the words hit me with the force of a physical blow. "My dearest Nora," the letter began, "if you are reading this in my old office, Then you have done exactly what I always knew you would do. You have taken back our home. I watched Beatrice and Richard try to break your spirit for years. I watched them elevate Trent, parading him around like a king, while he possessed the intellect and temperament of a court jester. But I also watched you. I saw the way your brilliant mind worked, the way you observed, calculated, and patiently built your strength in the shadows. You were always a wolf among sheep, Nora. They simply mistook your silence for weakness. I knew about your cybersecurity firm long before you thought you were hiding it from me. I watched you build your empire from a tiny, freezing studio apartment, turning lines of code into an impenetrable fortress. You are the only true heir I have. That initial $900,000 check I left you, the one they tried so incredibly hard to take away, was never your full inheritance. It was just a down payment on your future. It was the capital you needed to finish your weapon and sharpen your claws. Use this company wisely. Rebuild it from the ashes. Show the world what a real sterling looks like. I love you, Henry. I read the words a second time and then a third, letting the profound validation soak into my bones. The tight, cold knot of anger and resentment that had lived deep in my chest for an entire decade finally unspooled. I folded the parchment carefully and placed it in the inner breast pocket of my blazer right over my heart. A single quiet tear slipped down my cheek and fell onto the polished mahogany desk. It was not a tear of sadness or lingering grief. It was a tear of absolute, unadulterated closure. The brutal war was officially over, and the vicious ghosts of the past were finally laid to rest. I wiped my face cleanly, my expression hardening back into intense professional focus. I sat down in the high-backed leather chair, the material creaking slightly under my weight as I settled into the seat of power. I reached out and hit the power button on the primary workstation terminal. The massive dual monitors flared to life, casting a stark, icy blue glow across the quiet room. I typed in my new administrative credentials, entirely bypassing Trent's locked systems and accessing the core executive mainframe. A staggering list of overpaid, drastically underqualified vice presidents, bloated vendor contracts, and fraudulent subsidiary accounts instantly populated the screen. They were all Trent's cronies, yes-men and sycophants who had fed off the company's lifeblood for years. I cracked my knuckles, my fingers hovering over the keyboard with lethal intent. It was time to clean house. 6 months vanished in a relentless whirlwind of federal audits, asset liquidations, and ruthless corporate restructuring. The systemic rot was surgically excised from the bone, and the resulting justice was as swift as it was absolute. Trenton Sterling, the former golden boy of the Boston elite, currently resides in a maximum security federal penitentiary in upstate New York. He traded his imported Italian silk suits, custom-tailored tuxedos, and platinum watches for a stiff, bright orange jumpsuit that hangs awkwardly off his rapidly diminishing frame. There are no private jets, no corner offices, and no sycophants laughing at his terrible jokes to earn a promotion. His days are strictly measured by harsh buzzers, metallic clangs, and mandatory head counts. He spends his allotted recreation time pacing the barren concrete yard, muttering to himself about how he was set up, though no one listens. The arrogance that once defined his every waking moment has been entirely hollowed out. He is surrounded by hardened criminals who do not care about his trust fund or his golf handicap. He has been replaced by a hollow, dead-eyed shell of a man who finally realizes he is utterly insignificant. A few states away, Nia is serving a mandatory 5-year sentence for her central role in the international money laundering syndicate and corporate embezzlement. The State Bar Disciplinary Board made a highly publicized example of her. She was permanently disbarred, her license shredded, and her professional reputation burned to absolute ash. The woman who once prided herself on exploiting legal loopholes and outsmarting the system now works in the prison laundry facility, folding coarse cotton sheets for pennies an hour. Her perfectly manicured nails are chipped and broken. Her ruthless pride, once her most defining and dangerous feature, evaporated the very moment the heavy steel doors of the cell block slammed shut behind her. There was no golden parachute awaiting her. There was only the cold, unforgiving reality of a concrete floor and a numbered uniform. But perhaps the most poetic, devastating justice was reserved for Beatrice and Richard. When the federal marshals seized the estate, they took absolutely everything. The bank accounts, the luxury vehicles, the offshore trusts, and the priceless art collection were all liquidated by the government to pay the massive restitution fines. The high society friends they had spent decades meticulously cultivating dropped them instantly. In the ruthless, superficial world of the ultra-wealthy, poverty is treated like a contagious disease, and no one wanted to catch it. Today, Beatrice and Richard live in a cramped, dingy one-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. The walls are paper-thin, the heating is reliably broken, and the constant hum of highway traffic endlessly rattles the cheap windows. They spend their evenings arguing bitterly over unpaid electric bills, past due collection notices, and the sheer misery of their new existence, their harsh voices echoing through the tiny, cramped space. Richard, the former titan of industry, who used to command sprawling boardrooms with a single terrifying glare, now works as a frontline greeter at a massive big-box hardware store. He spends 8 grueling hours a day, standing on his aching feet, forcing a stiff plastic smile for minimum wage, handing out shopping carts to people who do not even look at him. Beatrice's daily reality is equally brutal. The woman who once hosted lavish charity galas and openly mocked anyone wearing off-the-rack clothing now works the customer service return desk at a discount retail chain. She spends her days folding discarded cheap sweaters and enduring the loud complaints of rude shoppers. Occasionally, a former country club acquaintance will walk into the store, recognize her behind the register, and quickly turn the other way to avoid eye contact. Every time she swipes her employee discount card to buy generic brand groceries, the humiliation physically twists her stomach. They have absolutely nothing left but each other, and they vehemently despise the reflection of their own colossal failures staring back across the cheap Formica kitchen table. I, however, have never breathed easier. I stood on the expansive glass balcony of my new penthouse headquarters, letting the crisp, clean morning wind whip through my hair. The view from the 50th floor offered a sweeping, uninterrupted panorama of the city skyline. Below me, the city pulsed with life and industry, and for the first time, I felt like I truly belonged at the absolute top of it. The corporate restructuring process had been a monumental, undisputed success. I formally merged the salvaged legitimate manufacturing assets of my grandfather's company with the cutting-edge digital infrastructure of Apex Cyber Defense. The synergy created an unstoppable corporate juggernaut. We were no longer just a ghost-tier cybersecurity firm or a legacy industrial supplier. We were a global tech empire built on a foundation of absolute transparency and relentless innovation. The stock prices had skyrocketed following the purge, and the board of directors, now populated by people of genuine merit rather than nepotistic cronies, backed my every strategic move. But the crowning achievement of the massive merger was not the profit margin. It was the Henry Sterling Philanthropic Foundation. I took the initial $900,000 my grandfather had left me, multiplied it by 10, using my own corporate funds, and established a massive grant program dedicated to providing full-ride STEM scholarships for young, brilliant women from marginalized backgrounds. I made absolutely sure that no girl with a talent for code and a vision for the future would ever be told her dreams were a waste of time. Grandpa Henry's name was finally associated with building people up rather than tearing them down. I took a slow, deep sip of my black coffee, the rich, bitter warmth grounding me in the present moment. The heavy glass door slid open behind me. I turned to see my inner circle stepping out onto the balcony. Arthur Gallagher was there holding a digital tablet and smiling warmly, completely thriving in his new role as my chief financial officer. My lead engineers, the brilliant, eccentric minds who had helped me map Trent's fraudulent network in a freezing studio apartment years ago, were laughing loudly and passing out fresh pastries from a local bakery. This was my true family. They were not bound to me by blood obligation or the toxic, suffocating expectation of blind loyalty. They were a chosen family forged in the trenches of hard work, mutual respect, and absolute trust. They saw me for exactly who I was, and they deeply valued the strength I brought to the table. There was no golden child here, and there was certainly no scapegoat. There was only a team of brilliant, dedicated people ready to take on the world together. I leaned back against the glass railing, watching the morning sun rise higher over the gleaming skyscrapers. The ghosts of my past no longer haunted me. The voices of doubt installed by decades of my mother's cruel comparisons and my father's cold dismissals were finally silenced forever. I had fought a brutal, silent war for my own survival, and I had emerged completely victorious. I looked at the people laughing and talking on my balcony, the massive empire I had built pulsing beneath my feet, and the endless, unwritten horizons stretching out before me. I smiled, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of absolute peace settle over my soul. Sometimes the people who should protect you become your greatest adversaries. When a family chooses to tear you down and label you a failure, you owe them nothing. True strength is built in the shadows of their doubt. You do not have to accept the role of the scapegoat or set yourself on fire to keep toxic relatives warm. By walking away and building your own empire, you forge your ultimate armor. Silence is not weakness, it is preparation. If you have ever had to cut ties to save yourself, share your story below and subscribe for daily empowerment today.